On a warm, windless afternoon, with lifeguards watching from their towers, someone is being dragged out to sea. This isn't happening on some remote, storm-battered stretch of coastline. It's happening in the middle of one of the most photographed, most patrolled, most reassuring-looking beaches on Earth. Over the past 5 years, more than a dozen people have died in Australia, in almost identical circumstances, on beaches with golden sand, gentle-looking water, and no visible sign of danger. Surf scientists who've spent entire careers studying this exact phenomenon say that number is only the confirmed tip of something much larger, and the reason so many people never see it coming is simple. The danger itself was never built to be seen. This is the story of Australia's most deceptive coastline, from Bondi Beach in Sydney, patrolled every single day by professional lifeguards, to a quiet, glassy lagoon on the far side of the continent in Western Australia, where the calmest patch of water on the beach is, more often than not, the most lethal one. Modern science eventually gave this phenomenon a name. Long before that name existed, the first peoples of this coastline already had their own way of reading it. If you're new here, welcome to Hidden Origins. This channel exists to unearth Australia's hidden history, its ancient sacred sites, its buried geology, and the mysteries still sitting quietly across this continent's landscapes and coastlines. If you want to keep exploring the unknown side of Australia with us, subscribe now, because this is one of the strangest and most important stories we've told yet. To understand why this keeps happening, you first have to understand what Australia's coastline actually is. This country has more than 11,000 beaches, more than almost anywhere else on Earth, strung along a coastline long enough to wrap most of the way around the equator. Most of these beaches share the same basic anatomy, fine sand, shallow sandbars running roughly parallel to the shore, and waves that roll in, break across those bars, and push enormous volumes of water toward the land. That water cannot simply stay there. It searches for the fastest route back out to sea through a gap scoured into the sandbar, a channel carved by a rock shelf, or a natural break beside a headland. Surf scientists call this a rip current. Dr. Rob Brander, the University of New South Wales researcher, known nationally as Dr. Rip, describes them as rivers of the sea narrow, fast-moving channels of water flowing straight out past the breakers, sometimes faster than an Olympic swimmer can move through open water. At any given moment, researchers estimate that as many as 17,000 rip currents could be active somewhere along Australia's beaches. Here is the part that makes them so dangerous. A breaking wave is loud, white, and chaotic, full of foam and obvious motion. Exactly what most people picture when they picture dangerous surf. A rip current looks like the opposite. Because the water inside it is deeper and moving too fast to break into white water, it often appears darker, flatter, and stiller than the water around it, a smooth, glassy gap between two walls of crashing waves. To an untrained eye scanning a beach on a hot afternoon, that gap doesn't read as a hazard. It reads as the calmest, safest place to swim on the entire beach. Very often it is the exact opposite. Long before rip current became a scientific term, this coastline had people reading it. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are, in many parts of the country, known as saltwater peoples communities whose law, identity, and daily survival have been bound to the sea for longer than any other living culture on the planet has occupied a single place. Aboriginal culture is widely recognised as the oldest continuous culture on Earth, and along the coast that continuity was built on close working knowledge of the water, how it moved, when it turned, where it was safe to fish, and where it demanded caution. Traditional custodians describe sea country the same way they describe land, as something named, known, and storied, down to individual reefs, sandbars, and channels. Dreaming tracks, the ancestral narratives connecting people to specific features of the landscape, extend beyond the shoreline and into the water itself, carrying practical, generational knowledge safely across thousands of years inside story and song. Even the naming of specific stretches of coast often carried a warning inside it. Bondi Beach, now one of the most recognisable beaches on the planet, sits on Gadigal country, and its name is widely understood to come from an Aboriginal word describing water breaking over rocks. That is not simply a poetic image. It is a functioning geographic account of how that water behaves, a detail anyone swimming there today would still benefit from knowing. On the opposite coast, the lagoon at Yanchep sits on Noongar country, where generations of saltwater knowledge shaped exactly how and where people moved along that shoreline, long before European settlement. None of this means ancient communities had a phrase that maps neatly onto a modern textbook term. What it means is that they understood, long before anyone else, that this ocean could not be judged by how it looked from the sand, that it had to be read carefully the same way you would read a track or a sky before a storm. Modern science would eventually arrive at a version of the very same lesson. The pattern repeats through the record, decade after decade. In January 2007, a young doctor from Mongolia, about to begin postgraduate study at the University of New South Wales, entered the water at the southern end of Bondi Beach, a stretch locals had already nicknamed the Backpackers Express for how reliably it swept tourists and newcomers out past the break. He drowned in a current that, in footage taken that same day, is barely visible at all. It remains one of the most cited cases in Australian rip current research, precisely because the beach around him was patrolled, crowded and calm. Bondi's lifeguards still carry out roughly 2,500 rescues every year, the overwhelming majority of them tourists who never suspected the water they'd chosen was the fastest moving stretch on the beach. On the other side of the country, at Yanchep Lagoon in Western Australia, a different version of the same story has played out more than once. The lagoon looks almost artificially calm, a sheltered pocket of turquoise water behind a low limestone reef, popular with families precisely because it looks so protected. But that reef channels and accelerates what scientists call a topographic rip, with recorded speeds of up to 1.5 metres per second, funneled straight through the gap families use to wade in. Over a 6-year period, 3 people drowned there, in water many visitors had assumed was the safest spot on the beach. Then came the Easter long weekend of 2025, when Cyclone Tam pushed a powerful offshore swell into much of Australia's eastern coastline, turning it lethal almost overnight. Over 4 days, 7 people died along the coasts of New South Wales and Victoria. A 9-year-old boy trapped between rocks at Southwest Rocks. A father swept from the water near Guatemala, while his teenage son was resuscitated beside him. A 24-year-old man lost off the rocks at Little Bay. Another man missing near San Remo in Victoria. Surf life-saving crews carried out more than 150 rescues across that single weekend alone. And in March 2026, a British father and his 17-year-old son drowned at 1770 in Queensland, a beach with no lifeguard cover for 50 kilometres in either direction. A local man who went in after them was pulled from the water with life-threatening injuries of his own. 4 incidents, spanning almost 2 decades and 3 states, on beaches hundreds of kilometres apart. Every single time the water looked calm. If you're waiting for the supernatural explanation, the curse, the vanishing, some unexplained force reaching up from beneath the sand, keep watching. Because what researchers actually found is even stranger than that. Make sure you're subscribed to Hidden Origins before we get there. Stories like these tend to attract theories that have nothing to do with the water itself. Online, some of these beaches get nicknamed Australia's own Bermuda Triangle, as though something unexplainable were reaching up from below. Others assume sharks must be the real danger of fear, so deeply wired into how people picture the Australian coast that it is almost impossible to shake. When scientists actually went looking for the real cause, the answer turned out to be both simpler and far more common than either theory. On Australian beaches, you are, on average, roughly 20 times more likely to drown than to be bitten by a shark. It isn't close. Nor is this a problem confined to weak swimmers or careless tourists, as comforting as that idea might be. Research into rescue-related drownings has found that a significant share of victims are the rescuers themselves, most commonly Australian men in their 30s and 40s, who went into the water after someone else in trouble and were caught by the very same current. Fitness and swimming ability offer surprisingly little protection. A rip current can move faster than a competitive swimmer, and fighting directly against one only speeds up exhaustion. The clearest investigation into all of this has come from Dr. Rob Brander's Science of the Surf program at UNSW, where researchers pour harmless purple dye directly into rip currents and film what happens next. The footage is difficult to argue with. Dye released into that flat. Calm-looking gap between the waves doesn't drift lazily out to sea it rockets away in seconds, visibly outpacing anyone nearby. Surveys conducted alongside this research have found that close to 70% of Australians cannot correctly identify a rip current, even when they are specifically asked to look for one in a photograph of a real beach. There is no curse here, and no monster in the water. There is a well-documented, measurable, entirely physical phenomenon. The real mystery was never what causes it. It's why so few people have ever been taught to see it. Here is the reveal, and it isn't a comforting one. A rip current requires no malice, no bad luck, and no dramatic storm to kill someone. It only requires ordinary waves, an ordinary sandbar, and an ordinary afternoon. That is precisely what makes it more dangerous than any myth could be. A shark attack is rare enough to make international headlines. A rip current is, quite literally, active somewhere on this coastline right now, potentially at any one of roughly 17,000 points on almost any beach with breaking waves, including the ones with lifeguard towers, phone signal, and a full car park. It does not distinguish between a 9-year-old boy, a competitive swimmer, a local who has swum that same beach 1,000 times, or a visitor seeing the ocean for the first time. It simply moves water from the shore back out to sea, obeying the same physics at the same kind of spot, every single time. The calm one. That is what makes the old warning folded into this coastline's place name so unsettling in hindsight. Saltwater peoples never needed a laboratory or a dye trace to understand that this water could not be judged by its surface. That understanding was built into language, into song, and into the names given to the water itself, knowledge precise enough that traces of it still survive, recognisably, in a beach name as famous as Bondi. It has taken modern science generations of drowning statistics, tagged drift buoys, and purple dye experiments to arrive at a conclusion that was already folded into this coastline's oldest stories, that calm is not the same thing as safe, and that this water has always demanded to be read, not assumed. The most dangerous beach in Australia is rarely the one that looks wild. It is the one that looks like nothing could possibly go wrong. Maybe that's the real thread running through this coastline's history, ancient knowledge, and modern science, separated by tens of thousands of years, arriving at the same lesson from two different directions. The ocean was never obligated to look as dangerous as it actually is. What's changed is how much has been forgotten about reading the signs earlier generations once knew by heart. So next time you're standing on an Australian beach and you spot that one calm, glassy patch of water between two breaking waves, remember what's actually moving beneath it. Have you ever been caught in a rip or noticed one nobody else could see? Tell us in the comments. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden side of this continent with us, subscribe to Hidden Origins. There's a lot more still buried out there.